What's the most unbelievable or outrageous thing you've ever seen at a wedding? Your story? Story 1. I was at a wedding where the groom was so nervous that he almost fainted during the ceremony. But that wasn't the most outrageous part. The bride's ex-boyfriend, who had apparently never quite gotten over her, showed up uninvited. He had been sending her flowers for months, and despite her telling him she was getting married, he still showed up to crash the wedding. Right in the middle of the vows, he barged into the ceremony, walked down the aisle, and tried to pull the bride away. Security and the groom both tried to stop him, but the ex refused to leave, yelling about how they were meant to be, and how the groom wasn't the right guy for her. It took about 10 minutes for him to be escorted out, and the whole time, the bride was shaking, the groom was sweating, and the guests were just awkwardly looking at each other, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Eventually, the ceremony resumed, but the tension was palpable. I don't know what happened to the ex-boyfriend afterward, but I'm pretty sure he'll never live that down. Story 2. A couple of years ago, I attended a wedding where the maid of honor, who was also the bride's best friend, completely stole the show. Now, I'm not talking about her speech or anything. No, she showed up in an absolutely ridiculous outfit, like something out of a runway show. It was this massive sequined gold gown that totally outshined the bride's dress. To make things even worse, she gave a speech that was supposed to be about the bride, but turned into a full-blown monologue about her own life and her troubles with relationships. But the real kicker was when, during the reception, she grabbed the microphone and announced that she was in love with the groom and had been secretly in love with him for years. The room went dead silent. The bride? She had a nervous breakdown and had to be escorted away by her parents. The maid of honor tried to chase after her, but it was too late. The groom was understandably furious and told her off in front of everyone, which of course led to a giant shouting match. By the end of the night, the maid of honor was escorted out, and the bride's family was left trying to salvage the event. The wedding was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Story 3. I've been to some strange weddings in my time, but one stands out above the rest. It was my cousin's wedding, and everything seemed normal until we got to the reception. The bride's father, who had a bit too much to drink, decided he wanted to sing a song for the newlyweds. Now, I should mention that the man was tone deaf and had never once mentioned wanting to perform in public before. He took the stage with a microphone, and instead of a sweet love song, he launched into a heavy metal cover of I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston. Yes, you read that right. A metal version of the song. He was headbanging and screaming into the mic, completely oblivious to the horror on everyone's faces. The bride looked mortified, the groom was speechless, and the guests didn't know whether to applaud or stage a rescue mission. Halfway through the song, the groom, in an attempt to save the day, jumped onto the stage and tried to calm things down. But the father, still in the zone, pushed him away, and the chaos continued. The wedding went from elegant to absolute chaos in about 3 minutes. It took the bride's mother about 5 minutes of pleading to finally get him off the stage. The groom ended up taking the microphone for the last song, but the damage was already done. Story 4. At a wedding I attended a while back, things went south when the bride's stepmother decided to announce a huge family secret. During her speech, she got up, raised a glass, and said, "Here's to the happy couple, and I'm sure we're all as excited as I am to find out the truth about, well, you'll see soon enough." Everyone froze. The bride turned pale, and the groom looked like he was about to pass out. After a very awkward silence, the stepmother made it even worse by continuing, "Oh, come on, we all know about the affair. You really think she didn't find out about your little escapades?" The entire room was in shock. The bride's father started yelling, trying to stop her, but it was too late. The guests were whispering, the bride was sobbing, and the groom was staring at his shoes. It turns out that the bride's stepmother had known about an affair the bride's father had been having, and she thought it was her responsibility to air the dirty laundry. Needless to say, the wedding was a disaster. The bride ended up running out, and the reception turned into a bitter confrontation between family members. The wedding was over before it even really began. Story 5. I went to a wedding where, during the vows, the bride made a sudden shocking announcement. After the groom said his vows and she was about to speak, she looked at him, then at the guests and said, "I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I can't marry you." Everyone went completely silent. The groom stood there, frozen. The bride continued, explaining that she had been having second thoughts for weeks and couldn't go through with the marriage. There was an awkward silence before the groom finally managed to speak, asking her what was going on. What made it even more unbelievable was that the bride then turned to one of the groomsmen, a guy she had been secretly seeing behind the groom's back, and kissed him in front of the entire crowd. The groom was left standing at the altar, stunned and speechless. The guests were in shock. Some people got up and left immediately while others just stood there, unsure of how to react. The bride and groomsmen quickly left together, and the wedding was, well, officially called off in front of everyone. It felt like a bad reality TV show, and I still can't believe it happened. Story 6. I had the misfortune of attending a wedding where the best man decided that his speech was an opportunity to air some very personal grievances about the groom. You see, the groom had once been in a relationship with the best man's sister, and it ended pretty badly. Instead of keeping the focus on the couple, the best man took the microphone and launched into a rant about the groom's commitment issues and how he had broken his sister's heart. At first, everyone was confused, thinking it was just some strange joke, but no. He kept going. You remember that time you didn't show up for your anniversary dinner and then texted her that you were too busy with work? Yeah, I remember that too. The groom was sitting at the table, visibly sweating and getting redder by the second, while the bride had her head buried in her hands. The atmosphere was tense. Some guests were laughing awkwardly, while others were just uncomfortable. The bride's family was furious, and the groom's side of the room was silent, unsure whether to defend him or let it unfold. The best man finally wrapped up his speech by saying, "Well, despite all that, I'm sure you two will be happy. Because, well, at least he'll try to be a better husband than he was a boyfriend." It was so awkward, and needless to say, the reception was quiet for a while after that. The bride's parents asked the best man to leave, and it was a while before anyone could really enjoy themselves again. Story 7. A few years ago, I went to a wedding where the groom's wild cousin showed up. Let's call him Dave. Dave was that guy who thought it was his personal mission to make every family gathering about him, and this wedding was no different. He arrived extremely late, clearly intoxicated, and went straight to the bar. No one had seen him much during the ceremony, but when the reception started, he was there, front and center on the dance floor. He made a scene almost immediately by grabbing the microphone during the couple's first dance and singing the most inappropriate song you could imagine. It wasn't a love ballad or even a fun party song. It was the theme song to a popular action movie, complete with weird, exaggerated sound effects and growls. People stared in shock as he belted out lyrics that had absolutely nothing to do with weddings, and the bride and groom looked utterly mortified. Then, things got even worse. Dave started performing acrobatic flips on the dance floor, knocking over chairs, spilling drinks, and almost injuring some guests in the process. The bride's mother, who was a very dignified lady, went up to him and tried to calm him down, but Dave was beyond help. The reception turned into a chaotic mess, and while some people were in good spirits, the couple's first dance was ruined. By the time the groom's father stepped in and had Dave escorted out of the venue, the damage was done. It's safe to say that no one in that room will forget Dave's antics anytime soon. Story 8. It was my best friend's wedding and everything was perfect. Well, almost everything. The wedding itself was beautiful. Picturesque venue, perfect weather, and a fantastic ceremony. But during the reception, there was a completely unexpected twist. The bride and groom had set up a small area for guests to leave notes of advice or funny memories in a guest book, and they had a photo booth for people to take silly pictures. What nobody had expected was that the groom's cousin, who was a bit of a troublemaker, had swapped out the photo booth's backdrop for something unusual. Instead of the standard wedding-themed backdrop, there was an image of the bride's ex-boyfriend holding a sign that read, "I was here first." It didn't stop there. Apparently, the cousin had also been circulating this picture to all the guests who took photos in the booth. When the bride and groom found out about it, they were understandably upset, and the cousin had to be called out in front of everyone. He tried to act innocent at first, but it quickly became clear he was just being malicious. The bride was furious and nearly walked out of the reception, but the groom stepped in, telling her to stay, and he took care of the situation. Unfortunately, the damage was done. The reception was awkward for the rest of the night, and although things calmed down by the end, I'm pretty sure that cousin wasn't invited to any future family events. Story 9. I once attended a wedding where everything was going smoothly, until the cake cutting. The bride and groom were about to slice into the massive, beautifully decorated cake when the groom's mother suddenly stood up and announced she had something to say. We all thought it was just another heartfelt speech, but it was anything but that. She began by expressing how disappointed she was in the bride. Apparently, she had some deep-rooted issues with the bride's family, and the wedding was her last straw. The bride was standing there, cake knife in hand, staring in disbelief. The groom looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. The groom's mother went on about how she'd never approved of the bride and how the couple had no future together. She mentioned that she had been trying to warn him about marrying someone with such a complicated background. At that point, the bride's father, who was usually a quiet man, stood up and confronted her. The argument escalated quickly, with the bride's father calling out the groom's mom for trying to control every aspect of their son's life. It took a solid 5 minutes for anyone to calm the situation down, and the bride's mother had to intervene. The wedding reception continued, but there was a clear divide between the families. The cake cutting happened, but it was far from the joyous moment it should have been. Story 10. This wedding took place in a small, tight-knit community, so everyone knew each other. The groom was well-liked, but his mother was infamous for being a little too involved in his life. I'm talking about the kind of mother who had to approve every friend, every job decision, and of course, every potential partner. When the groom announced he was getting married, his mother didn't take it well at all. During the ceremony, as the bride was walking down the aisle, the groom's mother stood up and started shouting, "Stop! Stop this wedding!" The entire room went silent as she stormed up to the altar, shaking with anger. She began accusing the bride of stealing her son and said that the marriage was a terrible mistake. The bride was so stunned she froze mid-walk, and the groom looked like he had just seen a ghost. The officiant was trying to calm the situation, but the mother wouldn't stop. Eventually, the groom had to leave the altar, walk over to his mother, and drag her out of the room. It was incredibly awkward, and the ceremony didn't continue until about 30 minutes later. They had to clear the air with the mother, and when they finally got back to the altar, the mood had completely shifted. Fortunately, the couple was strong enough to push through, but it made for one of the most uncomfortable wedding days I've ever witnessed. Story 11. I'll never forget the wedding where the bride had a surprise for everyone. It was a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, but the moment the vows were exchanged, something unusual happened. The bride's mother, who had been visibly emotional throughout the ceremony, stood up and announced that she had to clear the air before the couple moved forward. Everyone looked at her in confusion as she started to speak. She revealed that the groom's father, who was supposed to walk the bride down the aisle, had actually been secretly involved in an affair for several months. The groom's mother had known about it but never told anyone. The bride's mother said she couldn't let her daughter marry someone without knowing the full truth. The room went completely silent. The bride stood there, her face pale as a ghost, while the groom looked like he was about to collapse. The groom's father was visibly angry and tried to defend himself, but his wife kept him from speaking. The bride's mother kept talking about the betrayal, even accusing him of deliberately ruining their family's reputation. The groom didn't know how to react, and the bride broke down in tears. It wasn't until the officiant stepped in and calmed everyone down that things finally settled. The ceremony resumed, but it felt like an entirely different atmosphere. The groom later apologized to his bride for not telling her about his father's affair, but the tension between the families was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Story 12. I once attended a wedding where everything was going smoothly until the reception. It was a casual affair, and most of the guests were already enjoying their drinks and dancing when the groom's childhood friend decided to make an announcement. He had been drinking heavily, and when he stood up to give a toast, we all knew it wasn't going to be typical. Instead of offering well wishes to the couple, he proceeded to tell the most bizarre story. Apparently, years ago, he and the groom had gotten into a bit of a messy situation involving a stolen car, some fake IDs, and a run-in with the police. He went into detail, not only embarrassing the groom but also involving the bride in this, even though she had no idea what had happened. The entire room was stunned. The groom's face turned bright red, and the bride, who was already nervous about public speaking, looked as though she wanted to sink into the floor. The best man quickly stepped in and took the microphone, but the damage was already done. The groom had to apologize to everyone for his friend's inappropriate behavior, but people were still whispering about it throughout the night. As if that wasn't enough, the childhood friend, now quite tipsy, later tried to dance with the bride, insisting that they had a special connection because of all the trouble they'd gotten into together. It was incredibly awkward, and by the end of the night, the groom had to step in and politely ask his friend to leave the venue, which only made things even more uncomfortable. It's safe to say that this friend wasn't invited to the next wedding in the group. Story 13. This wedding took place at a charming vineyard with beautiful views of the hills, and it was truly a picture-perfect setting. But things took a strange turn during the reception. The bride had a cousin who was known for being a little eccentric, but no one expected what she did next. She began by giving a speech, which seemed pretty normal at first, but then she started talking about her own love life. She recounted a bizarre story about how she was once engaged to someone who had cheated on her with a guy from her yoga class. But instead of ending the story gracefully, she went on to explain how she had forgiven him and how she had taken him back after a dramatic reconciliation at a beachside retreat. The groom's family was already visibly uncomfortable, but then the cousin went one step further. She claimed that the groom had been the one to help her see the light and made her realize that true love means forgiving and giving second chances. The groom, who had no idea what she was talking about, just stared at her in disbelief. The bride was furious and tried to stop her cousin, but she wouldn't let up. The whole room was left in shock, and the bride's face was beet red as she stepped in front of her cousin to stop the speech. The groom eventually had to apologize for the awkward moment to his family, and everyone tried to move on from it. But needless to say, it was the talk of the night, and that cousin definitely became the most talked about guest. Story 14. I was at a wedding once where the best man, who was also the groom's older brother, gave a truly memorable speech, except it was memorable for all the wrong reasons. At first, he started with a heartfelt toast about how he admired his brother and how proud he was to see him getting married. But then, the speech took a weird and uncomfortable turn. The best man began reminiscing about their childhood and went into detail about a particular prank they played on their parents involving the family dog, a hidden cake, and a surprise birthday party. While it might have been funny at the time, it was completely inappropriate for a wedding speech, especially considering that the bride's family was present. But it didn't stop there. The best man then proceeded to make what can only be described as very inappropriate jokes about the groom's relationship with his new wife. He said something along the lines of, "Well, we all know he can't handle the real responsibility of a relationship, so thank God he has her to keep him in line." The bride, who had been smiling up until that point, suddenly looked uncomfortable and stared at the ground. After a few awkward laughs, the best man quickly wrapped up his speech, but the damage was done. The bride's family had already started murmuring, and some guests began heading to the bar early to escape the tension. The groom's face was completely red with embarrassment, and later that night, he had to apologize profusely to the bride and her family for his brother's behavior. Story 15. The most unbelievable thing I've ever witnessed at a wedding happened at a friend's ceremony. It was a beautiful affair. Outdoor venue, fairy lights, and an elegant atmosphere. Everything was going according to plan until the wedding planner disappeared. This wasn't a small issue. She was responsible for making sure the whole event ran smoothly, but no one could find her. At first, we thought she had just stepped away for a moment, but hours passed, and she was nowhere to be found. The couple, already stressed with all the big day jitters, were now scrambling. They called her phone, but there was no answer. Guests were starting to get antsy as the dinner didn't begin on time, and nobody could explain why the DJ wasn't setting up. Eventually, one of the bridesmaids admitted that she had overheard the planner on the phone earlier in the day, talking about how she was feeling overwhelmed and wasn't sure she could handle it anymore. Apparently, in the middle of the event, the planner just up and left without telling anyone, leaving the bride and groom to handle things on their own. Thankfully, some of the other staff members stepped in and managed to salvage the evening. But the fact that the wedding planner disappeared in the middle of a wedding, without any prior notice, left everyone in shock. The bride and groom handled it with grace, but it was an event none of us will ever forget. Story 16. I've been to a lot of weddings, but the one I attended last summer will forever stick with me for all the wrong reasons. The ceremony itself was beautiful, until the reception, that is. The groom had a great group of friends, but there was one who, for lack of a better word, was just the worst. Let's call him Steve. Steve had known the groom for years and always seemed to make everything about him. From the moment the reception began, he was the center of attention, constantly boasting about how he knew the groom better than anyone. During the speeches, he had a chance to give one of his own, and that's when the madness began. Instead of offering kind words or memories, Steve decided to make the entire speech about himself. He regaled everyone with stories of their childhood, but in each one, the groom seemed to play a minor, almost forgettable role. He told everyone how he had been the real leader of the group and how, without him, the groom would never have even found his way to the church. His whole speech was filled with exaggerated, bizarre stories where he was portrayed as the hero, and the groom was the sidekick. What took things over the top, though, was when he started to mock the bride. He didn't mean it maliciously, but it was incredibly awkward. He joked about how the groom had finally settled down, which was met with uncomfortable chuckles from the guests. But then, he dropped the bomb. He said, "Well, if you're anything like the last girl, I'm sure this marriage will be a breeze." The bride's face went white, and the groom was clearly furious, his hands clenched tightly by his side. After a very long silence, the groom finally stood up and calmly asked Steve to stop. The guests were all staring at Steve, and some of them were visibly shaking their heads. In the end, Steve was asked to leave by the groom's father, which led to an awkward evening where the couple spent the rest of the night trying to calm down their guests. Story 17. A wedding I attended a couple of years ago had everything you'd want. Romantic vows, a picturesque venue, and even a beautiful outdoor reception. But the most unbelievable part came about halfway through the reception. The bride's maid of honor, who was one of her childhood friends, had been acting a little strange all evening, but we couldn't figure out why. It wasn't until she grabbed the microphone to give her speech that things started to go downhill. At first, it was all fine, with the usual funny stories and heartfelt compliments to the bride. But then, out of nowhere, She made an unexpected comment, and I'm so happy that bride found someone who can take care of her after I couldn't. Everyone in the room froze, unsure of what was happening. The maid of honor then started talking about how she and the bride had been in a complicated relationship for years, and how the bride had secretly confessed her feelings back when they were in high school. The entire room went dead silent. It turns out that the maid of honor had been in love with the bride for years, but had kept it to herself. Now, years later, as the bride was about to marry another man, the maid of honor finally decided to confess her feelings at the worst possible time. The bride, who was standing next to her, was visibly shocked and seemed to go pale. The groom's expression went from confusion to frustration, and the whole reception felt like a train wreck waiting to happen. The maid of honor kept rambling, mentioning how she was devastated by the news of the wedding, even though the bride had never shown any romantic interest in her. After what felt like an eternity, the bride had to step in, telling her friend that she loved her like a sister, but that it was time for everyone to move on. There was an awkward silence, and the maid of honor quickly excused herself from the stage, humiliated. The night ended with the bride and groom having to calm down their shocked guests. It was one of the most uncomfortable weddings I've ever attended. Story 18. I'll never forget the wedding where the bride's ex showed up uninvited. The bride and groom had known each other for a few years, and they were clearly head over heels in love. The ceremony went smoothly, and the reception was live, but there was one thing that no one was expecting: an appearance from the bride's ex-boyfriend. Let's call him Mark. He didn't just show up casually. No, Mark made an entrance right in the middle of the reception, striding confidently into the venue, right past the bride's family. He walked straight up to the newlyweds, interrupted their first dance, and with an almost manic look in his eyes, loudly declared that he was in love with the bride. The room went silent. The bride turned bright red and quickly pulled away from the groom, who was visibly furious. Mark went on to explain how he had always known that the bride was the one, and how he couldn't bear to see her marry someone else. He tried to kiss her on the cheek, but the groom immediately stepped in, pushing him away and demanding that he leave. But the ex didn't back down. He started shouting that he would never let her go, and that the groom wasn't good enough for her. At this point, the bride's father, a big man who had been calm throughout the ceremony, stood up and physically escorted Mark out of the venue. The chaos lasted for a solid 10 minutes, and no one knew whether to laugh, cry, or be utterly uncomfortable. Needless to say, after Mark was gone, the reception felt like a very different affair. The bride was understandably shaken, and the groom spent the rest of the night keeping a protective eye on her. It wasn't until much later that the couple managed to salvage the evening and enjoy themselves again. But I don't think anyone in that room will ever forget Mark's dramatic interruption. Story 19. A wedding I attended a few years ago involved a groom who had a very unique sense of humor. The ceremony was lovely, and everything was going according to plan until the couple reached the part where they exchanged rings. The groom had a surprise for everyone. He had customized the bride's ring, and not in the way you might expect. When the officiant asked for the rings, the groom proudly handed over the bride's band, which at first glance seemed like any other elegant piece of jewelry. However, when the bride slipped it onto her finger, she was met with an unexpected engraving. Best decision of my life, so far. The bride was initially speechless, her eyes wide in confusion, and the guests couldn't help but gasp. Was it a joke? The groom smiled, clearly proud of himself as the bride stared at him, unsure whether she should laugh or be annoyed. She had no idea the groom had chosen to make the engraving a little playful. She'd thought it would be something more traditional. After a few moments of stunned silence, the groom leaned in and whispered, "It's because I know I'm going to make more good decisions, but I wanted to start with this." The bride finally cracked a smile, and the guests let out a collective sigh of relief. Still, it wasn't lost on anyone that the humor had thrown off the entire ceremony for a good minute or two. To be fair, the bride did laugh it off later during their vows, but it was certainly one of the more unusual wedding ring engravings I've ever seen. I can't help but wonder if he's regretting that decision during their arguments, though. Story 20. I went to a wedding where the bride's mother made a scene that no one was prepared. It started off as a wonderful day. Everyone was excited for the newlyweds, the venue was beautiful, and the guests were in high spirits. But then, during the reception, the bride's mother decided to give a speech that took a sharp turn into madness. At first, the speech was sweet and emotional. She talked about how proud she was of her daughter and how much she loved her new son-in-law. But then, without any warning, she began to criticize the groom's family. She started talking about how she felt left out of the planning process and how the groom's parents had dominated the whole event. She even mentioned how she didn't like the wedding favors they'd chosen and how she thought the whole ceremony should have been more extravagant. The groom's mother, who had been standing nearby, immediately stepped forward and tried to calm her down, but the bride's mother wasn't finished. She called out the groom's father, accusing him of being cold and disinterested in the whole thing. The guests were sitting in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. Finally, the bride's father had to step in and physically escort his wife away from the microphone. The tension in the room was palpable. It was one of those moments where everyone was just waiting for someone to say something to break the ice, but no one could. It took a good while for everyone to get back into the celebration, and by then, the bride had retreated to a quiet corner, trying to compose herself. Story 21. I'll never forget the wedding I went to where the entire reception was turned upside down by the groom's uncle. This man was an absolute wild card, known for showing up at family gatherings and making things interesting. He had a reputation for saying what was on his mind, no matter how inappropriate it was, and on this particular wedding day, he did not disappoint. It all started when the best man gave his speech. It was touching, filled with stories about the groom, and everyone was in good spirits. But then, the groom's uncle stood up and grabbed the microphone. He didn't ask for permission, he just took it. He began by saying how proud he was of his nephew, but then suddenly veered into a long and very awkward story about the groom's first girlfriend. It wasn't just an innocent tale of high school love. No, the uncle gave us all a play-by-play of how the groom had messed things up by kissing his girlfriend in the back of his car, and how it didn't go well. The entire room was silent. The bride was red-faced, mortified, and the groom looked like he wanted to disappear. The uncle didn't stop there. He then proceeded to describe every bad decision the groom had ever made, including a drunken night out when he got a tattoo on a dare that said, "I'm forever young" on his ankle. The groom had to finally step in, laughing awkwardly as he tried to get the microphone back. He said, "Uncle, we appreciate the memories, but let's let everyone enjoy the night." After the uncle was escorted away by security, the atmosphere was tense. The night went on, but no one really felt like partying after that. It was an unforgettable evening, though, just not in the way anyone had hoped. Story 22. A wedding I attended years ago took a strange turn when the bride's father had a bit too much to drink. The ceremony had been beautiful, and everything was going according to plan. But during the reception, the bride's father, who had been seen sipping wine throughout the night, stood up to give a speech. His words began sweet as they often do, but then they started to get a bit odd. He began reminiscing about how he used to take care of everything when the bride was younger, describing in vivid detail how he used to fix her mistakes in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. He continued to say how he was so glad she found someone who could take care of her, because honestly, I'm not sure how many men could handle her. At this point, everyone was starting to shift in their seats. It wasn't until he started talking about her past relationships that things took a turn for the worse. He casually mentioned her failed engagements over the years, as if he were recounting the most normal of family stories. He talked about how the first fiancé had left her because of her temper, and how the second one was too much of a mama's boy. By the time he moved on to her third ex, some of the guests were looking for the nearest exit. The bride was in tears, sitting at the table, and the groom was trying to comfort her while also looking like he was ready to explode. It took the groom's father stepping up to pull the bride's father off stage, but the damage had been done. The rest of the evening was a somber one, and I think everyone knew this was going to be a wedding people would be talking about for a long time, for all the wrong reasons. Story 23. This wedding took place in a small town, and everything was going perfectly until the groom's ex-wife showed up. The groom, who had been married before, had made it clear that his ex was no longer in the picture, but apparently she had a different idea. It was during the reception when the groom's ex-wife walked in, looking confident and well-dressed, like she had every right to be there. She made her way to the front of the room and just stood there, staring at the groom, who was caught completely off guard. The bride, who was standing nearby, turned around to see her, and her face went from a bright smile to one of sheer shock. The ex-wife didn't speak at first. She just stood there, silent. The guests were all staring, unsure of what was happening. Then, the groom's ex-wife loudly proclaimed, "I'm here to remind him that I'll always be his first love, and that no one can take that away." The groom, looking absolutely horrified, quickly approached her and tried to get her to leave. She wouldn't go, and instead started to go off on the bride. She said things like, "He's only marrying you because you're younger and more naive, and you'll never have the bond we had." It wasn't until the groom's family stepped in that the ex-wife finally agreed to leave, but not without causing a scene. She shouted that the marriage would never last and stormed out of the venue. The guests were left speechless, and the bride was in tears. The groom spent the rest of the night reassuring his new wife that he was fully committed to her and that his ex was simply acting out of jealousy. Though the evening wasn't ruined completely, it was definitely a memorable night, just not for the right reasons. Story 24. This wedding had a surprise that no one was expecting, least of all the bride. The groom had planned the most romantic proposal on their anniversary, and everything seemed perfect. They were both very close to their families, and the groom decided to invite their families for a celebratory dinner to mark the special day. But at the dinner, the groom's sister, who had always been somewhat of a difficult person, showed up and started to act strangely. At first, no one noticed, but when she stood up to give her speech, it became clear that something was off. She began talking about how she had always supported her brother's relationships and had always been there for him. Then she dropped the bomb. She began to confess that she had been secretly in love with the groom for years. She told the entire room how she had been holding on to feelings for him, even after he started dating the bride. The awkwardness was palpable as she said things like, "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but he was always the one I wanted. And now you're going to take him away from me forever." The bride froze, looking shocked, and the groom just stood there in disbelief, not knowing how to respond. The sister continued, clearly not aware of the gravity of her words, until the groom's father intervened, asking her to sit down and stop making things uncomfortable. After the situation was diffused, the bride's family quietly left the event, but it was clear that the evening was never going to be the same. The couple was in a difficult position, but the groom eventually talked things out with his sister, reassuring her that the feelings weren't mutual. However, the night felt strange from that point onward, and everyone knew it would be a long time before things returned to normal. Story 25. A few years ago, I attended a wedding that became a wild story in the making. Everything seemed normal at first. Beautiful venue, elegant ceremony, and an excited group of guests ready to celebrate. But at the reception, one guest had an unexpected revelation that caught everyone off guard. The groom's childhood friend, let's call him Ben, was asked to give a toast. He stood up confidently, raised his glass, and began with a funny story about the groom. But as he continued, the stories took a more uncomfortable turn. Ben started to reminisce about how the groom had always been lucky in love, but not necessarily in the way you would expect. He began telling the guests about how the groom had been dating around for years, but how he had never really been faithful. He talked about how, while the groom was dating the bride, he had jokingly mentioned seeing other people. The bride's face was completely pale as she tried to control her emotions, and the groom was visibly sweating as he tried to stop Ben, but the damage was already done. The groom's family looked horrified, and the bride's mother stood up to leave, while the bride looked like she was about to burst into tears. After a tense few moments, the groom finally stepped up to take the microphone from Ben, apologizing profusely and quickly, trying to change the subject. Later, it turned out that Ben had misinterpreted a conversation with the groom about his past relationships and had tried to make a joke, but there was no recovering from that moment. The reception became awkward, and while the couple tried to salvage the night, I think everyone knew the night would be one of the most unforgettable and uncomfortable weddings anyone had ever been to. Story 26. A wedding I attended several years ago took an unexpected turn when the bride's maid of honor decided to go rogue. The bride and her maid of honor, let's call her Sarah, had been best friends for years, and the bride trusted Sarah to help with every detail of the wedding. Everything was going smoothly during the ceremony, and the reception was in full swing. The maid of honor was the one to give the first speech, and everything seemed normal at first. She shared how happy she was for the bride and how honored she was to be a part of the big day. But then, Sarah started talking about the time she almost married the groom herself. The whole room went silent. Sarah casually mentioned that she had dated the groom briefly in college and how their relationship ended due to the groom being unsure about his feelings. This revelation alone was enough to make the bride nervous. But then Sarah kept going, saying things like, "I knew he was the one for her, even when he wasn't sure yet. It's funny how love works out, isn't it?" The bride's face turned pale. She was speechless, and the groom looked like he had just seen a ghost. No one knew how to react. There was an awkward silence as the bride tried to gather her thoughts. The maid of honor, seemingly unaware of how awkward it was getting, kept talking about how she always knew that the groom would come around and realize that he wanted to be with the bride forever. Finally, the groom stood up and interrupted the speech, saying, "All right, Sarah, let's leave the past in the past, okay?" But the damage was done. After Sarah sat down, the bride quickly excused herself from the table, and the rest of the night was filled with tense conversations and worried looks. While the evening didn't completely fall apart, there was a definite sense of discomfort for the rest of the night. The maid of honor's speech would be remembered as the most awkward part of the wedding for years to come. Story 27. At a wedding I attended, the bride and groom had planned a fun, lighthearted reception with games, dancing, and even a special wedding trivia contest for the guests. But as soon as the trivia game began, it quickly became clear that not everyone had gotten the memo about keeping things lighthearted. The game was supposed to be a way for guests to learn fun facts about the couple, and they were even giving out small prizes to the winners. But one particular guest, the groom's aunt, decided to take matters into her own hands. Instead of answering the questions like everyone else, she turned the game into a bitter attack on the groom's family. The first question was about where the couple had met, which the bride quickly answered. But the aunt took this opportunity to chime in with a story about how, back when the groom was a teenager, he got involved with the wrong crowd and how the bride deserved better. The room went silent as she went on about how the groom's bad decisions had caused his parents years of grief. She kept mentioning how she thought the bride could do better. The groom, who had been sitting at the table next to his aunt, looked absolutely horrified. He tried to stop her, but she wasn't done. She launched into a full-on rant about how the family wasn't as happy as they appeared and how the bride was too young to understand what she was getting into. At this point, the bride's face had turned crimson, and many of the guests were trying to awkwardly laugh it off. But the tension was unbearable. The groom's parents quickly stepped in, asking the aunt to step aside. The whole situation left the bride shaken, and while the night continued, the atmosphere had been irreparably altered. The aunt didn't get a prize, but she certainly became the talk of the evening, much to the embarrassment of the groom and his family. Story 28. It was a beautiful spring day when I attended my cousin's wedding. The ceremony was held in a quaint chapel, and everything seemed perfect. But what happened during the reception completely caught me off guard and turned into a total disaster. During the reception, a large group of the groom's college friends were seated at one of the back tables. They had all known each other for years and had a history of raucous behavior, so it wasn't a surprise when they started getting a little rowdy. However, things took a serious turn when one of them, let's call him Tom, stood up to give a toast. At first, it seemed like a typical speech. Tom started talking about how the groom was his best friend and how happy he was for the couple. But then, out of nowhere, Tom made a comment about the groom's past, specifically the groom's past relationships. He started describing, in excruciating detail, the groom's romantic mishaps and how he always managed to find the most interesting women. The bride, who had been listening attentively, started to get visibly upset. The groom's face was turning red, and some of the guests were trying to hush Tom, but he kept going. He even gave an explicit account of how the groom had cheated on a previous girlfriend, and how he knew he was really ready to settle down with the bride because he finally learned from his mistakes. The guests were shocked. It wasn't until the bride stood up and interrupted him saying, "I think we've heard enough," that things started to calm down. The groom tried to apologize to the bride, but it was clear that Tom had caused irreparable damage. The bride excused herself, and the rest of the evening was incredibly awkward. Tom was asked to leave, but by then, the night had been ruined for everyone. Story 29. One of the most bizarre weddings I've attended happened a couple of years ago when the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up uninvited to the ceremony. The groom and his ex, let's call her Emma, had dated for a few years before he met his now wife, but Emma had apparently not fully let go of the relationship. The groom was at the altar with his bride exchanging vows when Emma stormed into the church, loudly declaring, "This wedding cannot happen." She made her way down the aisle toward the couple, and the guests, already in shock, began whispering. The bride, clearly stunned, froze in place while the groom seemed equally bewildered. Emma began shouting at the accusing him of breaking her heart and saying that she had never truly gotten over. She tried to drag the groom away from the altar, pleading for him to come back to her. The groom, realizing what was happening, tried to calm Emma down, but it was clear she wasn't having it. At this point, the bride, though visibly upset, stepped forward and asked Emma to leave. She wasn't going to let this woman ruin her big day. Security was called to escort Emma out of the church, and after some tense moments, she finally left. The groom was shaken, but after a few minutes, he returned to his bride, and the ceremony resumed. However, the mood was far from the joyful celebration it had been moments before. The bride and groom still managed to make it through the day, but everyone there knew that the ex-girlfriend's dramatic interruption would be the talk of the wedding for years to come. Story 30. I once attended a wedding where the groom's father had been way too involved in the planning process. Now, it's not uncommon for parents to have some input, but this was next level. The groom's father was convinced that everything had to be perfect, and he wasn't shy about expressing his opinion. During the reception, the groom's father, who had been drinking heavily, grabbed the microphone for an impromptu speech. At first, he started talking about how proud he was of his son, and how happy he was that he had found the right woman. But then, things started to take a strange turn. The groom's father began talking about how he had always known his son would get married, and that it was just a matter of time. But instead of keeping it lighthearted, he went on and on about the bride's family dynamics, making offhand comments about how the bride's father wasn't quite as involved as he should have been. He even joked that Maybe the groom was the better father figure in this situation, which made everyone feel uncomfortable. The bride's family looked visibly upset, and the groom was trying to figure out how to stop his dad. But it wasn't until the groom's mother finally stepped in, pulled her husband off the stage, and said, "That's enough," that the awkward moment ended. The rest of the evening was quieter than expected, and while the groom apologized to his bride's family, no one really felt the same after the speech. It was clear that the father's overstep had cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful night.